Hello and welcome back to Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the best utility lands for Commander. Now, these are going to be lands that are having some kind of extra bonus. They're not just tapping for mana. They have some kind of use outside of helping you cast your spells. And there's a lot of those. And today we're going to be talking about some of the best ones for the format. Hi, I am your host, Morgan. And joined with me today is Jason. Jason, how's it going, man?
Going pretty good. I got my coffee. So life's pretty good right now.
Yes, I had a couple cups before we got on today, where our recording schedule is a little bit different today, which is why Preston's not joining us today. Just had conflict with timelines and all that with this week. It happens, and it's okay. We have notes from Preston, so we'll make sure that he's still a part of this, even though he's not physically here with us today. So before we hop into our list of some of our favorite utility lands, reminder that you can support the show by heading over to patreon.com/geekandseek YouTube. People who join us on Patreon also get to hang out in our Discord. We talk Magic. You get to see some of our videos a little bit early, stuff like that. And then if you can't support us financially, that's fine. You can help us out a lot by just leaving comments on our video. There's a direct correlation between videos that get a lot of comments and videos that do well. So that is the best way that I can tell to help us out. You can also hit like, share us with your friends. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not. And we have over 200 other videos. Just check them out. Listen to some of our other podcast episodes. We have our Commander gameplay series. We have other stuff that we've done. Check it out. All right. And favorite comment of the week. This is from Jacob. Jacob's been our favorite comment of the week a couple times, if I remember. This is in reference to the newest episode of our Commander gameplay series, where we played upgraded precons from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. The thumbnail is pretty good. Everyone's got like finger guns. All right, guys, everyone pose with a finger gun for the thumbnail. And then Preston, absolutely slaying. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's a good thumbnail. And Preston responded to that saying something like, Olivia demands the best or something like that. It's pretty good. As far as news, only thing that was really worth mentioning is that we had a standard pro tour for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. This is the first time we've kind of gone back recently to how we used to do pro tours, is that they would happen pretty soon after the new set comes out. Because the problem is if you wait too long after the set comes out, then people have already figured out what the best cards are and the format kind of settles. But because this Pro Tour happened so soon after the set came out, it hasn't been solved. So we got to see a lot of really wacky decks and cool new brews with a lot of the cool new cards. So the meta looks sweet. I linked it here so Jason can pop up what a lot of the decks were, what the meta breakdown was for the Pro Tour. Yoshihiko Ikawa won with Domain Ramp. I'm sorry, I probably mispronounced your name, but it was a really sweet deck, and a lot of really sweet decks got to show up in the Pro Tour. I gotta ask though, I love Standard. I think Standard the last year and a half, 2 years has been amazing, but I also know that Jason, you're not the biggest 60 card guy. What would it take for you to try Standard?
Well, all right, first of all, I want to say this. It's not that I'm against 60-card formats because, I started playing Modern. That was the first thing that I played when I started playing Magic. Honestly, they would have to start making the packs a lot cheaper because if I have to buy new cards every time a set comes out to replace the cards that, were just legal in the format a week ago, it's having to constantly spend money whenever new standard legal sets come out to replace the standard legal set cards that just went away. And then, I'll play a deck for a little bit. One thing that I think I will say, Standard does a really good job of bringing in new things for people to play and people to try. It's different from Commander in the sense that I don't just get to build a deck and then 5 years from now can still play the same deck. So it definitely makes deck building a little bit more interesting when you have to constantly go back and reconfigure your deck, and maybe you have to change what it wants to do in order to keep it the same or what have you. But having to buy cards constantly whenever new sets come out, that is a big thing for me. I just don't want to have to spend all that money. So if they brought the price of the packs down, I'd probably be more into standard.
That's really unfortunate. With now they don't have set and draft boosters anymore, and they just have the play boosters, and it's actually a little bit more expensive.
Yeah.
So
it was they went in the opposite direction of what would bring me into standard.
Yeah.
But
if it makes you feel any better, some of the tier decks are actually cheap. Like you could build some of the tier decks for like $100, $150, something like that. Does that help?
I'd rather spend $100 or $150 building a commander deck that I can play 2 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
But I mean, hey, standard's doing all right without me. It's not like standard needs me to keep going or to improve. So. Sure. Yeah, and I do think that in a lot of ways Wizards is doing the right thing in getting people reinterested in Standard, because when I started playing Magic, Standard was really popular still, but then, COVID happened and Eldraine happened, OG Eldraine happened, and, just those couple things with a couple other factors, people kind of fell off of Standard, and I think they're doing the right things to get people reinterested in the format. I think up until now, I think the last time that I saw a lot of interest in Standard might have been Theros Beyond Death.
Yeah, that was the Standard where
Oro got
things were starting to fall off.
2 seconds.
Yeah, things were. That was a weird time. But I think now that Standard is 3 years instead of 2, I think that helps. I think that now
that is I guess I would say that is another thing that would pull me into Standard, is if they expanded it beyond just 3 years. And I know that they just went from 2 years to 3 years, so I'm kind of asking for a lot by asking for more time. But if you just make cards legal for longer, and then I feel like I will feel like I'm getting more out of my money. You know what I mean? And I will say, I enjoy draft. Like I would spend the money on packs for a draft experience, because drafting is fun. It's a whole new way to play the game, like different from constructed formats where you're building something and you're play testing it and then making sure that it's perfect or optimized as much as possible. Draft is a lot more raw, and it's a lot more like improvisational, and that type of stuff I'd like. So I would spend the money to do draft and stuff like that. But keeping up with Standard as a format, I just feel like that Commander's expensive enough as it is. I don't really need to add another expensive format into my play.
Yeah, I can get behind that.
I should honestly just play Arena more. And that would save me all.
You should.
I would save me all my money. I would never have to spend a dime on packs. I mean, to make a good Standard deck in Arena, I probably should get a pack or two or maybe a couple. But theoretically, I don't have to on Arena.
Yeah, I always tell people that if you want to try Arena, take a look at the format, take a look at the deck diversity and whatnot. Figure out what deck you want before you start building, because then you can be smart about how you're spending your wild cards, and you can just play Arena for free. Because the economy does kind of suck on Arena, but if you're smart with how you spend your wild cards, you can literally play like top tier decks without ever spending a penny of real money.
I will say this too. The one thing that holds me back from playing Arena consistently is if I step away from Arena for a little bit and then I have to update Arena. Oh my God, it takes 4 days.
It takes a while.
It takes 4 days, 10 days to update Arena. And I'm like, well, now I'm not going to play this for a while it updates. And then after it's done updating, I've forgotten that I wanted to play it, and it's done updating, and it's ready for me. So then more time will pass, and then I'll get back to, I want to play Arena. Now it has more updating to do. It's kind of a vicious cycle that I find myself in with Arena. But Arena's fun.
Yeah.
I like Arena.
Yeah, in Arena, I think that's the biggest argument for not playing Paper Standard. Them bringing Standard Pro play back, I think helps incentivize people to try, especially now they reconfigured how you can qualify to play in the Pro Tour, that it does make it easier that if you want to play Paper Standard, there's a easy route to take to try playing professionally, and some of the decks aren't that expensive. But then the main argument I hear is like, well, if I'm really good on Arena, I can just play Standard on Arena for free without having to spend any actual money. And then I can do it in my underwear at home without having to go down to the game store or whatever.
See, but then what they do is they make you think that you can win a Pro Tour. And so you start getting the paper cards and you're like, I'm going to win so much money. And then you don't even make it past
then
the
you don't top 8
round.
yeah.
You don't even get anywhere. And you're like, damn it.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and head into our main topic today, which is talking about utility land. So heading into this, me, Jason, and Preston all put together a list of
Preston, Jason, and I. How about we grammar right?
No. So we put together a list personally of our own top 10 to 12 cards that we thought were worth mentioning, and then we kind of combined them all together, and that's going to be the 12 or 13 cards that we start off with. And then if we have time at the end, we'll hit the other cards on our personal list that didn't make the overall list. So we're just starting off with the cards that at least a couple of us agreed on. I wanted to start with something that I thought was interesting, though. None of us had Reliquary Tower on our list. So Reliquary Tower is a land that taps for colorless that says you have no maximum hand size. It's in 28% of decks according to EDH Rec.
Oh my god, how did we... I'm looking at this list now.
None of us said Reliquary Tower.
I remember when I was making this list. I was like, okay, well, I know cards. I know a few that I don't even have to research. Like, obviously there's Maze of Ith. I talked about that in the last podcast episode. And then I was like, Reliquary Tower is an obvious one. So, okay, Field of the Dead's another obvious one. And I just never put Reliquary Tower on my list. How did I forget that?
I don't know. Well, with that said, do you think 28% makes sense? Because
100%.
You think?
Well, think about how much card draw has been introduced into the format, into Commander specifically, over the past couple of years alone. Every time I think about something like this, I always just think about the way that Wizards has improved white over the past couple of years. And I mean, now we get cards like Archaeomancer's Map, where you're putting more lands into your hand. That's white's way of kind of
land tax.
Yeah, card draw is such a prevalent thing in Magic that just having a land in there that it just sits on the table and says you have no maximum hand size, that by itself is good enough, especially in today's Commander climate, I should say.
I have Reliquary Tower in several of my decks, but I actually think Reliquary Tower is kind of overrated.
I think when I build decks, I always include Reliquary Tower as a land slot. I'm pretty sure, unless it's just a deck where I don't feel I'm going to be having a ton of cards in my hand or drawing a ton of cards. Honestly, the more I play it, my Jalira Master Polymorphist deck, I need to put a Reliquary Tower in there because I don't have one in there, and I could use that. I don't think I have Reliquary Tower in Finn. I just don't find myself having a ton of cards in my hand at any given point. There's situations, but I feel like there's situations in any game of Commander, no matter how you've built your deck, where you'll find yourself with a lot of cards in your hand. And just based on that situation alone, should you automatically include Reliquary Tower just because you might run into that? No, I don't think so. I think that if your deck is designed to either draw a bunch of cards or just draws a bunch of cards just because of the other things that the deck is trying to do, then maybe Reliquary Tower becomes an auto-include. But I mean, you know me, dude. I love drawing cards. Who doesn't love drawing cards, man?
Yeah. So I actually do think that Reliquary Tower is a little overrated because it doesn't tap for colored mana. So when you get to, in 1 or 2 colored decks, probably not a problem. But then when you get to 3, 4, 5 colored decks, it's like, okay, not that I won't run any utility lands, but I can't run a ton, right? I have to make sure my lands tap for the right colors and whatnot. Yeah. And I also find that Commander players are just abnormally against discarding down to hand size. They just really don't like doing it. But who cares if you have the difference between having 7 or 9 cards is significant enough that you could maybe consider it. But if you have to discard down to hand size, you're just keeping your best 7. that's still better than probably everyone else at the table. So it's not that bad. On top of the fact that, like, I know there are people who put Reliquary Towers in their graveyard decks. That is wrong.
It is 100% wrong.
Because you want to discard down to hand size in those decks. Yeah, a good little honorable mention. It's kind of weird that none of us mentioned it because it's such a popular, well-known card that people like to just jam in decks. I think it's a little overrated, but it does go in some decks. So it is odd that none of us mentioned it.
I almost wonder if, and this is going to be an old reference for some of you out there. You might not even know what I'm talking about. But it almost might be like the Chris Daughtry effect, where we all thought that someone was going to have Reliquary Tower on their list, so it's like, I don't need to include it. It's already taken care of.
Yeah.
Oh man, do you get that reference? Do you get that American Idol reference?
I actively listen to Chris Daughtry several times a week. Let's go ahead and move into our list proper now that we got the honorable mention out of the way. First up, I have this in roughly the order of if we averaged them out. It's not perfectly, but this is roughly the averaged out list. Number 1 is Bojuka, which according to EDHREC is the most played utility land. It's in 31% of.
Oh wow! So we kind of hit the nail on the head with that one.
Yeah. Oh, I misspoke. Not most played, but percentage-wise, it's the highest. So, like, Reliquary Towers played in more decks, but it's in 28% of possible decks.
Right, yeah, and it's a colorless land, so it can go in any deck. Bojuka Bog can only go in black. Okay, I got you. Honestly, Bojuka Bog should go into almost any deck that has black in it. It should go into every mono black deck.
Every mono black deck for sure. Probably all 2-color black decks as well.
I would say
so. Bojuka Bog is enter the battlefield taps for a black. When it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. So the upside is you get to nerf the graveyard deck. The downside is, and I don't know if this has been your experience with it, Jason, I've had a lot of games where I just have to play Bojuka Bog as my land for the turn, even if I'm not like hurting any of my opponents doing it. And then sometimes, even if you are playing against the graveyard deck, sometimes you just don't have it. So I know that a lot of people are just playing Bojuka Bog to be responsible and have some graveyard hate in their deck. But do you think this is sufficient? Do you think this counts as enough graveyard hate?
100%. 100%.
You think?
I mean, there's potential to repeat it if you can get the land into your hand again and then play it again. Yeah, there's if you can get the activation of it more than once, if you can get the trigger more than once, then it's already become one of the best lands in your deck just because you were able to get that trigger twice. Second, the situations where you need it, its utility in those situations far outweighs its uselessness when you don't need it. Like using it in like the mid to late game when you exile like the graveyard player's graveyard, that alone is such a game-saving moment that it's worth risking playing it as your second or third land for turn and exiling no cards from somebody's graveyard. It is worth risking that just because of the potential, like, screw you it can do to somebody.
I mean, there's Expedition Map, which is the 1-mana artifact that you could pay 2, tap it, sack it, to put any land into your hand. It's also worth mentioning that if you're playing green, like if you're a green-black X, that you're even more likely to just have this when you need it. Like you're like, oh, the graveyard deck's about to pop off. Okay, crop rotation, or Archdruid's Charm, or, you know, like there are a lot of ways to just tutor any land into play, especially if you're playing green. There are a couple colorless ways to do it, but especially if you're playing green, you can have more of those redundant effects to make sure that you can always have it when you need it. So that's worth mentioning as well. Yeah, I think the important thing is make sure you have Graveyard Hate in your deck. And I think it's better to run Graveyard Hate that will be consistent, that if you need it, you have it. Whereas Bojuka Bog is kind of that. So just make sure you're running the support pieces to do that. How do you think this compares to Scavenger Grounds? So Scavenger Grounds is a colorless land, comes in untapped. It's a desert. You pay 2, tap it, sacrifice the desert, exile all graveyards. So the reason that I think in a lot of ways it's not as good as Bojuka Bog, but there is a upside to it that might make it better than Bojuka Bog is that it just says sacrifice a desert. You don't have to sacrifice it itself. So, like, obviously you're like, oh, well, in desert decks, like Hazazon decks, sure, it's probably okay there. It's not even just that, because in 1 and 2 color decks, you can nowadays run enough deserts that it might just be worth running, because you have the new dual deserts, you have the 1 and 2, the couple cycling deserts, there's the monocolor deserts from Hour of Devastation, I think. So in a 1 or 2 color deck, you can run enough deserts that you don't have to sacrifice the scavenger grounds. You could theoretically get multiple uses out of it, which is helpful if you're up against a graveyard deck.
I think one of the reasons that I would say Scavenger Grounds is not as good as Bojuka Bog is because you have to activate the ability. You have to pay mana and put the activation on the stack. Now, Bojuka Bog's trigger goes on the stack, sure, but just playing a land and then putting that trigger on the stack is going to catch players off guard a lot more of the time than when they're seeing a land on the battlefield with an activated ability, and they know that that ability can be activated at any point as long as that land remains untapped and the person has the mana to activate that ability.
The other downside that makes Scavenger Grounds not objectively better is that it hits all graveyards, which sometimes it's good, sometimes that's not going to hurt you, but sometimes you wanted to do something like maybe you have Sun Titan and you just wanted to get your Evolving Wilds back. Like, that's, you know, like that's a neat move. That's a cool trick, but, like, you know, sometimes
you wouldn't be using Sun Titan to get Evolving. I mean, you can, but it's
white ramp.
That's not the Sun Titan play that you're gonna be making most of the time.
Yeah. So Scavenger Grounds is not objectively better than a Bojuka Bog, but I think the comparison was worth making because there are situations where I like it.
I do think that it is a somewhat fair comparison, but I do think that Bojuka Bog is just like, for if you're trying to exile graveyards with a card, I do think that Bojuka Bog is just objectively a better card, even though it's hitting a single player's graveyard. It's just better than having a land that's kind of just the ability is telegraphed because it's on the battlefield and everybody sees it and knows that it's coming. Whereas, you know, you could just, I'm going to play this Bojuka Bog, exile your graveyard. Wait, what just happened? Huh?
Yeah. All right, so next up on the list is Strip Mine. Strip Mine is kind of a placeholder for a category of land, but Strip Mine is a land that taps for colorless, and you can tap it to sacrifice it to destroy a target land.
I'm going to objectively say that Strip Mine is probably the best land that destroys other lands.
I think it is because it taps for mana, which some of them don't, and then it also, you don't have to pay any mana to activate it. The only argument would maybe be that it puts you down the land, but if you really need to get rid of a problematic land, you probably don't care. But there is a category of land that just destroy other lands. So my personal favorite one, I don't know if you've seen this one, is Demolition Field. It's kind of new. It came from the Brothers War. Taps for a colorless, and then you can pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land and opponent controls. That player finds a basic. Oh, you and that opponent both find a basic to put onto the battlefield tapped. The reason I like Demolition Field, it's kind of like Field of Ruin, but Demolition Field's better because it's not every player, it's just you and the person you blew up. Because with Field of Ruin, you're just ramping the 2 players that weren't involved in the exchange, and that doesn't seem like a good plan. Whereas Demolition Field is like just the one land. And then we've talked about before, commander players get greedy and they won't run a lot of basics, so this might just effectively be an expensive Strip Mine at that point, but you still get the land. So
this is Strip Mine, but then for 2 mana, you and your opponent replace the lands that got taken off the board. Strip Mine is fair because Strip Mine taps for mana, and it can destroy another land, but you have to sacrifice the Strip Mine like as the cost. That is what you're sacrificing one of your lands to get rid of one of your opponent's lands. Really, the scariest land that they have on the board, like you're using this to blow up those Gaia's Cradles, to blow up those Cabal Coffers, things like that. And so, Demolition Field, it essentially reads the same as Strip Mine, but it almost is just for 2 extra mana, you and your opponent whose land you destroyed get to replace the lands that got destroyed. So I like this. I like this better than Strip Mine just because you are putting yourself back in a position where you're not down mana that you had previously. the lands, it doesn't even enter tapped. So, I mean, you'll still only, okay. So now it kind of reads, pay 1 mana, sacrifice Demolition Field, destroy target non-basic land. You know, because you're getting a land back, it enters untapped, so you're getting 1 of the 2 mana you spent on it back. So that makes sense.
It's also worth mentioning that these sacrifice lands have added upside in land decks specifically because they're going to have ways to loop them from the graveyard. So if someone has a lot of problematic lands, or if you're playing against another land deck and they keep looping their Field of the Dead, you can just keep blowing it up with your strip mine.
See,
keep them in check.
Here's the thing though. One thing that I will say, and this 95% of the time I'd say, this isn't really going to matter. And in all reality, you want it to be the other way around. But Strip Mine can hit any land. Demolition Field can only hit non-basics, which, again, like I said, most of the time you want to be hitting the non-basics. You don't care about hitting the basic lands or anything. But Strip Mine gives you that option. You know, I've seen many games where somebody's playing like a 2-color deck or a 3-color deck, and they only have like 1 or 2 sources of one specific color. Like we were playing in a game with Tommy the other day. Or no, this is the Thunder Junction episode where Tommy was just getting flooded with red mana, had like 2 or 3 blue sources. You know, that's one of the advantages of Strip Mine, is you can take out one of his... If one of us was playing that, we could have taken out one of his islands and just kind of neutered him a little bit more and just kind of kept him down instead of... and kept him from rebuilding and getting into a place where he could stabilize and kind of maybe come back and potentially win the game. But most of the time you are going to be hitting those non-basics with it. But it is nice that Strip Mine does give you that flexibility and you can hit basics if you want to.
I guess the only other downside to Strip Mine is that the cheapest legal version is $19. I didn't know it was that expensive.
Yeah.
But it also costs no mana to activate. You can just play it as your land and then immediately activate it.
That's the thing I was going to say about it, is like it doesn't enter tapped, so you can play it, activate it immediately if you need to. But then you can also just hold it up and you can use every other land that you have, and then just keep the Strip Mine sitting up because all you need is the Strip Mine in order to activate it. And then you can just hold it over people's heads. So it's another reason why I really like it, is because it can be used politically. You can use it as like, hey, I will leave your Gaia's Cradle alone if you don't do anything to me. If you don't use any of that mana that you're making, if you don't use any of it against me, I'll leave it alone. You could use it politically like that to your advantage.
Yeah. And there's enough problematic lands in the format now that I'm running at least 1 or 2 of these kind of effects in my decks, sometimes more, depending on the theme of my deck or whatnot. But yeah, they're good.
Do you count this as a land slot in your deck, or do you count it as land removal? Like, when you're putting this into your deck, how do you visualize this? Are you visualizing it as a card that's going to produce mana for you? Or are you seeing it as a card that's going to take away one of your opponent's best lands? Like, what do you see when you put this card into a deck?
In our current play group, I view it as more of a potential answer. I assume I won't need to crack it. I assume that I can probably just keep it as a land. But then if I need to crack it, I can. If our play group just on average, like we have decks in our play group that have more optimal mana bases and more utility lands, but on average, people have like barely better than pre-con mana bases, you know? In which case, I don't think I really need to crack them, but I like having the option. So there are exceptions, but I'm usually counting them as just my land slots, and then it just is an answer if I really need it.
Okay, so you're not really like playing it and then, thinking about and holding it up if you don't have a target on board in mind. Like, you're not just keeping it as a contingency plan. If you don't have anything on the board that you want to blow up immediately, you're going to use it for mana. Absolutely, yeah. I could agree with that.
All right, so next up on our list is kind of a boogeyman. This is Field of the Dead. It's a land that enters tapped and taps for a colorless, but when it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 zombie creature token. This is absurd because it will just turn on so easily. Even a lot of one color decks can turn on Field of the Dead. It's just too easy. I mean, this is a card that's banned in everything. It's banned in Pioneer, Modern, Explorer, Historic, Brawl, and it was banned in Standard when it was Standard legal. So this is debatably not a card that should be legal in Commander, to the point where Commander Clash just put it on their house ban list. It's annoying. And we've talked about house banning it for our gameplay series as well, because I've had a couple games where I play Field of the Dead and I just rebuild from a board wipe just by playing a fetch land, So it's kind of ridiculous. What do you think of Field of the Dead?
I think it's fine. I think that there are definitely some degenerate things that you can do with it, but I don't think that it's just the most broken utility land ever. I mean, first of all, you have to have 7 lands with different names before it starts activating. So minimum, this isn't going to be turned on until turn 7, earlier if you're ramping, for sure. But on average, this is going to be turned on turn 6, turn 7. That's about when this will get turned on average. By that point in the game, if you can't deal with 1 2/2 zombie coming in every turn, or even 2 or 3 2/2 zombies coming in every turn, by turn 6 or 7, you probably weren't going to win that game anyways. I mean, unless you're playing in a specific lands matters deck where you're trying to put as many lands onto the battlefield as you can, if you're just running Field of the Dead in every deck, any old run-of-the-mill deck, you're probably not playing more than 1 land a turn. So having to deal with 1 2/2 zombie every turn, not the end of the world, especially when you're in that mid-game part of the game. I've never once thought that Field of the Dead is the most broken card on the table. I've never been sitting at a game looking around like, I think the biggest problem on the board is Field of the Dead. That's never once happened. So
You did not play in the partner episode of Upkeep.
Fair.
I had multiple important Field of the Dead turns in that game. So here's the problem: there are times where Field of the Dead's not that bad, right? If you're just playing like any old 2-color deck and you're like, I theoretically will turn on Field of the Dead and get some zombie tokens, that's one thing. Or if you're like, I am playing a zombie deck, so I want to have a land that makes zombies because flavor, I get that too. But the problem is when you get into the green decks, because the green decks are like, okay, I'm going to play a fetch land. So that's 2 Field of the Dead triggers right there. And then I have like Exploration or something in play. So now I get to play a second land, and I have, oh, look, I have Crucible of Worlds, so now I can play that fetch land again. So now you have 4 zombies. Yep. And then it gets really bad when you talk about token decks, because a lot of token decks are green, which means not only are you doing all that stuff, but now you also might have Parallel Lives and or Doubling Season, so now you're getting even more. So that's where it becomes problematic. And then you also, not only do you have the land drops and the fetch lands and the extra lands per turn, but then you also can play like the Nature's Lords and the Farseeks and the Rampant Growth and just get extra lands that way. So the problem, this is something we've talked about a lot, Jason. Green decks are just the problem, all right? It's not Field of the Dead, it's green decks. Green decks suck!
That's exactly where I was going to go. So you're saying that it's a problem in green decks. So you're saying that it's a problem because it helps synergize with something that green wants to do a lot? Interesting. I wonder if there are cards in other colors that are really powerful because they synergize with what that color wants to do. Rhystic Study. Oh man, blue players. So you're telling me that we should ban Rhystic Study because Rhystic Study is really, really good for blue players who want to play a lot of spells or be really controlly and play all their counter spells, so they want to draw all that stuff into their hand to play it. So you're telling me that like, Torolf. Red's going to deal a lot of damage to a lot of different things. So you're telling me that we should ban Torolf because it now takes the extra damage that red is going to do and allows you to do some crazy, stupid things with it? It's a really, really good card in most decks. And it's a pretty busted card in green decks specifically. But if we just start banning cards that are good in certain colors, what are we doing? What are we doing? Why are we going to complain about it instead of just say, this is a card that exists. I need to run more targeted land removal in order to fight that.
I think it kind of comes into the 2-for-1 problem where a lot of those decks I mentioned will just, even if you answer the Field of the Dead, they can probably just get it back. So you kind of have to 2-for-1. You have to sack your Strip Mine to get rid of the Field of the Dead, and then you have to Bojuka Bog to exile the graveyard. Because if you don't do that, there's a good chance they're just going to get it back. So that's kind of the problem. And all of the answers that you said, I know like that premise makes sense. Like you can't just let the blue players stop playing good blue cards, but Rhystic Study can get blown up, Toralf can be removed, and then Field of the Dead can kind of get blown up by Beast Within. Like, I don't know. I feel like that's a different... It feels goofy wasting a removal spell on a land. So I think it's just a land problem.
It feels goofy, but then you look at what exactly you're removing with that removal spell. You're not just removing a land. You're removing a creature manufacturer. You know?
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that Field of the Dead, even if you don't have those token synergies or those landfall synergies, even if you just, get to the mid to late game and you are playing 2+ colors, now keep in mind that depending if you have more synergistic utility lands, you might not want to play it just because it comes in tapped and only taps for colorless. So that's something to keep in mind, but it will just... by doing normal game actions, playing lands, it will just give you blockers. So even if you don't have the inherent synergies to really pop off with it, it's often just objectively correct to play it anyways. All right. Next up is Urza Saga. So this is a Urza's Enchantment Land Saga. So first chapter, it taps for a colorless. Second chapter, you can pay 2 and tap it to create a construct. And then for 3, you sacrifice it and find a artifact with mana cost 0 or 1 to put onto the battlefield. And this is pretty sweet. Do you play Urza Saga in any of your decks?
I actually don't have an Urza Saga, only for the simple fact of I haven't purchased one yet. It's still a rather expensive land, if I'm not mistaken.
It is. It's still $30.
So it's not something that I don't need it, I mean, I have artifact decks like Gimbal. It would do really, really good stuff in Gimbal for sure. But Gimbal already is good enough that I don't really need to spend $30 on a land to add in just to make it a little bit better. Gimbal doesn't need to be a little bit better. Now, if the day comes when I pull an Urza Saga from a pack, then it's immediately
kind of luck that's possible.
It's immediately going into dude. I could buy an Outlaws of Thunder Junction pack and pull an Urza Saga. I swear to God, with my luck.
How'd I get there?
So, I think it's a really, really, really good, powerful utility land. I think that it is definitely more something you'll see in CEDH games. You'll definitely see this a lot more to grab those, Jeweled Lotuses or those Mana Crypts or the Mana Vaults. Mana Vault's a bad card. But I'm not just running this just so I can grab a Soul Ring or just so I can make a construct, unless it's specifically an artifact deck where I want to be making the constructs because I'm going to have a lot of artifacts on the battlefield, so my construct's going to be huge. Side note, we got together yesterday to play, and I stole Morgan's Urza Saga, and it was the first time
it did some work, didn't it?
It was the first time I'd ever played Urza Saga ever. And I was playing my Pirates deck, and I was making a bunch of map tokens. And so, before I went and searched for my Soul Ring, because that's the only 1 mana rock I had, 1 or 0 mana rock I had, I made a construct. And I didn't realize how many artifacts I had on the battlefield. That construct ended up becoming a 20/20. So I paid 2 mana, got a 20/20, and then searched for a Soul Ring, so I got that 2 mana back. So I basically put a 20/20 out there for free. And so that was really the first time that I had seen Urza Saga on my side and was like, this is actually a really good card.
Yeah. And like we said with a lot of these lands is that if you're a lands deck, you can loop them. It is best in artifact decks because those constructs are going to be huge, and then you're more likely to have... multiple hits for the last chapter. It is worth mentioning, though, that even if you're not an artifact deck, you might just have enough artifacts in your deck that the constructs could be worth making anyways, because they're decent attackers or blockers. Like if you're making treasure tokens, or you just have mana rocks, or whatever, even if you're not an artifact deck, it's probably like fine. The main thing that determines whether or not I run Urza Saga in my deck is I need to make sure I at least have a handful of targets for the last chapter. If I am just, because I remember when this card was previewed, everyone was like, it finds your soul ring, you know?
But
and
what if you already have your soul ring on the battlefield?
Exactly. Then your land just goes away and you get no added value out of it. So I always make sure that if I'm going to add Urza Saga into a deck, I need to at least have like 4 or 5 targets for it. And if I do that, like if I look at my deck after I won't like intentionally add more of those kind of artifacts to my deck to play Urza Saga. But if I am building my deck and I realize I have multiple Urza Saga's targets, then I'll go ahead and add it. So, but it's pretty good in those situations.
So for me, I think that Urza Saga is definitely something that it's really good, really powerful. You can see all the value on the card without even having to play it in a game, but it doesn't go into every deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So next up, we'll keep this one brief because we talked about this last episode of the podcast, but this is Mazavith, which is a land that doesn't tap for mana, but it taps to untap target attacking creature, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and by that creature this turn. So if you want to hear Jason go on about this card, check out last episode of the podcast where we talked about underrated cards. But why don't you just go ahead and in a minute or two, give people the main gist.
Okay, so I'll just give you my little spiel on Mazavith. I said in the last podcast episode that I thought Mazavith was the best utility land. After looking at all the utility lands out there, I don't think that's necessarily the most educated stance to take, but I do think it's still a top 3 utility land out there. I do think that it's better than Urza Saga just because you will get more use out of Mazavith in more games than you will out of Urza Saga. You're not always going to make a construct that's going to become, a 10-10 or a 20-20, something huge. You're not always going to have something to search for with that last ability unless you just have multiple targets in your deck when you build it, like you were saying before. So not only is Mazavith going to be something good that you could use to save your creatures, or even... And here's another thing that I didn't talk about in the last episode. You can use Mazavith after your creature has done damage. I don't know, for any of you that don't know how this works, combat happens in 5 steps. There is the beginning of combat step, there is the declare attacker step, there is the declare blocker step, there is the damage step, and then there is the end of combat step. When you get to that end of combat step, attacks have already happened, blocks have already happened, damage has already happened. You're in that end of combat step. Your creature is still technically in combat and declared attacking. So what you can do after you've done the damage, you can activate Mazavith and then untap your creature, remove it from combat, and then it says prevent the damage. The damage has already happened. Magic doesn't go backwards in time, and it doesn't remove stuff that already happened. So you're going to untap your creature and now have it up as a blocker after you've done the damage for it. And maybe it's a creature where you dealt combat damage and got a trigger, or attacked and got a trigger. Maybe it's an ancient copper dragon, and you get to make all these treasure tokens, and now you get to untap it and leave it up as a blocker. That's one of the things that I didn't mention in last week's podcast episode. That's one of the best ways to utilize it. That's what I use it in Urdragon for, is I'll attack with Urdragon, I'll get all the Urdragon triggers, do all that fun stuff, and then I'll untap it with the Mazavith, and now I have a 10-10 flying blocker that I can just protect myself with. You can do the same thing with your opponent's creatures. There's just a lot of utility use out of it, and I think that there are way more situations where you will use this card and it will be very effective than a card, say, like Urza Saga or Field of the Dead. Because, Field of the Dead, you play Field of the Dead on turn 3, it's not going to do anything for a long time except tap for mana. You play Mazavith on turn 3, you could potentially save yourself from taking a lot of early damage.
Yep. Yeah, and if you want to hear us go, I don't really have anything to add more to that. If you want to hear us go more in depth, we talked for like 10 minutes about Mazavith last episode, so you can go check that out if you would like. Next up, we have Command Beacon. This is a land that taps for colorless, or you can tap it, sacrifice it to put your commander into your hand from your command zone. This actually just got reprinted in the OTJ Commander Precons, thank God, because it's actually kind of expensive. So the main use of this is it's just a land, but then when your commander's been removed a couple times or whatever, and the commander tax is really high, well, now you can just put this into, you can sacrifice this to put your commander into your hand, which will get around the commander tax. So that's the use of this card. And I don't play this in very many decks. I think I have this in 2 decks, but it's pretty good in those 2 decks. I mean, the 2 decks I have it in are a Teamsys, where it starts off at 6 mana, and because it has a win the game clause, people want to remove it. And then the other one is Kozilek, because Kozilek is, 10 mana, I think. So in those kind of decks where your commander already starts off with a lot of mana and it's a must-kill threat, Command Beacon's kind of good.
This is honestly how I feel about Command Beacon. In every single commander deck where your commander matters, where you really need your commander on the battlefield to do the thing, which I would venture to guess is
commander decks.
85 to 90% of all commander decks. I would say probably 10 to 15% of commander decks do not revolve around the commander. I think that's probably a fair estimate. It should go into those 85 to 90% of decks that are built with the commander as the main part. If any deck where you really want to play your commander and have it on the battlefield while you're doing stuff because it's going to provide you with, X amount of value, or do this for you or do that for you, if your commander is that vital of a piece, Command Beacon should be in your commander deck without question. It should honestly be the first land you put into the deck. It's such a... In Commander specifically, this land has a lot of versatility to it. This gets around cards like Drannith Magistrate. I remember when Drannith Magistrate got printed, every single Commander player groaned and cried like, "Oh, why?" I was one of them. I'm not better than you. I was doing the same thing. But now we have this card, Command Beacon, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. We just play the Command Beacon, sacrifice the Command Beacon, put our commander in our hand, and we're good. This also saves you from certain cards that will steal your commander out of the command zone. I don't know that there are many, but there are cards that do that. Tevesh Sat, that's one of them. Somebody ultimates Tevesh Sat, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to activate my Command Beacon, put my commander in my hand, now I'm all good. I have my commander. Nobody else has their commander except for the guy who played Tevesh Sat. But just for the simple fact of this can put it into your hand when commander tax has made your commander virtually unplayable, it's worth it just from that instance alone.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, and I think in the modern day of commander design, that's probably more true. But I try to build at least a good chunk of my decks, definitely not all of them, but a good chunk of my decks, I try to build the old school way, which is your 99 is a theme, and then you just build a commander that works with it. So your commander is not like the most important card in your deck. That's how it used to be before we had all of this design for commander crap. That's just how commander decks worked. And that's how I try to build a lot of my decks because, Command Beacon, yeah, you could play in all your decks, but it's a colorless land. You can't run 100 colorless lands. And so unless I really, really, really need my commander, and my commander already starts off with a lot of mana, because also you have to keep in mind that if your commander is only 3 mana to start with and it dies a couple times, well, late in the game, you'll still have the mana, right? But if your commander starts off at 6 mana and it gets removed several times, that's a different story, right? So Command Beacon, I would say that there are situations where you should run it, but I don't run it that often. I think I only have it in 2 decks.
Just to kind of give you a perspective on where I'll run it, my Jalira Master Polymorphous deck, I don't run it in there because I activate my commander twice. Max, I activate my commander twice in a game, and then I don't need it anymore. It can die. I can do whatever. It can sit in the command zone for the rest of the game. I won't need it again. But then Urdragon. Urdragon's 10 mana. Urdragon gets killed. Now it's 12 mana. 10 mana was already, or excuse me. It's 9 mana, excuse me. Because it's 5, it's 1 of each color and 4. So it's 9 mana. Then it becomes 11 mana. It was already pretty expensive at 9 mana. Now you're telling me I have to pay 11 mana? God forbid it gets destroyed twice, and now I have to pay 13 mana? Being able to put it into my hand with Command Beacon it's a nice luxury to have. So those are the situations where I would and wouldn't run Command Beacon.
All right, next up on our list, we have Minamo, School at Water's Edge. This is kind of an expensive card. I didn't realize that, but the cheapest version is the list reprint, which is $40. So that's going to price a lot of people out. So I apologize, but this is a legendary land that taps for blue, or you can pay a blue and tap it to untap target legendary permanent. So this is noteworthy that it's... A lot of people will play it just because, like, oh, my commander has a tap ability, so now I can use the tap ability an additional time. And that's sweet. That's how I played in a couple of my decks. I used to have it in my Shorikai deck. I have it in my Teamsys deck right now. I think I have it in another deck or two. It's pretty good there. But it is any legendary permanent. So you can untap your legendary lands. You can untap your legendary artifacts. It's got a lot of added utility. You need to make sure that you at least have a couple realistic targets for it, because the floor of it is that you can do it to untap a creature to have an extra blocker after attacks. Like, that's the floor of this card, and I don't think that's worth $40. But if you have cards with tap abilities, this is pretty sweet.
It's one of the only utility lands that we're going to talk about today that taps for an actual color.
Right. That's worth mentioning, because a lot of these utility lands, the drawback is I can't run too many of these. I need to make sure I stick to the ones that fit with my theme, because I need to make sure I have my colored pips. So the fact that this will tap for colored mana is relevant.
It's kind of interesting. So the first time I got this card from the mystery boosters boxes. And what was weird, I don't see it. I mean, I'm looking here on Scryfall, and I don't see the cost of it from that set.
Maybe that's what the list slot is.
It could be. Because when I did get it, at the time when the Mystery Booster came out, I think it was like a $26 or a $30 land, something like that. But the Mystery Booster box version of it was like $15.
It's always been an expensive card, but it was funny because as soon as Shorikai came out, it went went way up in price. Because Shorikai is pretty popular and busted and has a tap ability.
And Minamo,
it's also you can hit the One Ring with it. Draw more cards. That's awesome.
what have you done?
I broke the internet.
You monster.
I've only done things that only other monsters have thought of. Next up, we have War Room. This is a land that taps for colorless, or you can pay 3 and tap it. Pay life equal to the number of cards in your commander's color identity to draw a card. Obviously, that's not very efficient. You have to think of it, it's kind of 4 mana draw a card. And you wouldn't do that unless you have like no cards in your hand, but all the mana in the world. Like, that's really the only time you're going to do it.
So real quick, I'm going to let you talk about this the same way that you kind of let me talk about Mazavith, because I don't really have anything to say about this. I am not a huge fan of this card.
Yeah, I think it was on Preston and I's list. I don't think it was on your list.
No, it was not on my list. 3 mana to draw max 3 mana, pay X life, draw X cards. That's almost how it reads, but you're limited to what X can be. It doesn't seem very efficient. I didn't include it on my list, so I'm not a huge fan of it. I'm gonna let you just kind of do your thing.
Yeah, the only thing I want to say about it is that it's borderline auto-includey in monocolor decks, just because the in one color decks the cost of running this is too low. Like, it's only about $1 card. And in one color decks, you can afford to run a little bit more utility lands than you would normally run. And then in the mid to late game, if you really don't have any gas, it's only one life that you're going to lose. So then it's pretty good. On top of the fact that in colorless decks, you will lose no life. In colorless decks, it's 4 mana to draw a card on a land, and colorless decks are running an ungodly amount of utility lands anyways because they can, so then you're really not worried about the opportunity cost of playing this. And then it's better in decks where you specifically are gaining a bunch of life, so you don't mind losing life, or you intentionally want your life low, like my life swap deck. So 4 mana to draw a card, and you're probably going to lose some life, is never good, but if you can afford to have a few utility lands and you find that you're in like mono red and you don't have a lot of raw card draw, this is probably a good one to add.
I like that you're saying it's 4 mana to draw a card because you do have to tap the War Room itself.
Yep.
Yeah, that just not efficient enough for me to play in a lot of decks. I don't think I run it in any deck. I might have it in one.
Next up is Boseiju Who Endures. This is a legendary land. This is a cycle of lands, and I think that Boseiju is not the only one of these that's playable, but I think Boseiju is arguably the best one. All of them tap for a color, and then they have a channel ability where you can pay the discard cost and then do something. Boseiju specifically is 1 and a green, costs 1 less to cast to activate. If for each legendary creature you control. Destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. Then they get to find a land to put onto the battlefield with a land type. So it's worse for your opponents in the sense that, or it's worse for you from your opponent because they could grab dual lands and triomes and stuff. They don't have to just grab basics like a lot of these effects do. But it's so flexible. And this, because it's a channel ability, it's not like a cast or anything. It can't get countered, right? So if you were going to go Beast Within Jason's Rhystic Study, he could counterspell it. But if you go to channel Boseiju, his Rhystic Study, he probably can't do anything about it unless he has Stifle? Does Stifle stop it? I'm not sure.
So Stifle would because it's an.
But who runs Stifle?
Well, yeah. Yeah, Stifle would work because Stifle works based on the last sentence of this card. This ability costs 1 less to activate. Mm-hmm. So it's an activated ability, so you can counter it with something like that. The only other thing I can think of is if you had like a protection spell that, gives whatever they're trying to target hexproof or shrouded instant speed. That is the only other thing I can think of that would protect it.
Yeah, the only other thing that's worth noting about these is that they will always come in untapped and tapped for colored mana. So if you have to, you want to use them for the channel abilities, but the fact that they are just decent lands is pretty good, especially if you are a graveyard deck and you can channel it and then play it later in the game from your graveyard. Or if you're playing bounce lands, you can play it as your land earlier in the game, and then if you need to blow something else later, play the bounce land, pick it back up, and then channel it.
See, here's one thing. Really, the only other thing I want to say about this, because I think just inherently this is an incredible card. I don't think that you play this for the channel ability. I don't think that that's the main reason you play this card. And I'm gonna reference the same thing that I've said about modal dual face lands. 90% of the time, you're playing those as the land. 90% of the time, you're going to play Boseiju Who Endures as the land. If you're holding it in your hand just for the channel ability and preventing yourself from playing a land for the turn just because you want to hold on to it, you're playing it wrong. You're playing it wrong. It is a land that has an additional ability on it that you can get use out of when you don't need it to be a land. But most of the time, you're just going to need it to be a land. So I would caution players who play cards like this, don't hold it in your hand just to use the second ability. Use it as the land when you need the land. That is the smart way to play these types of cards.
We have had that conversation before about lands. I don't know if it was specifically about Boseiju or something else, but it was the MDFCs that we were talking about.
Yeah, the last time that I talked about something like this, it was for modal dual face cards.
Yes. So the only, I mentioned this when you said it back then too, is that I think it depends on your land count. If you are someone like Jason who is running 33 lands in his deck, then yeah, that argument holds up, and I think that's correct. But then if you're also someone like, me or Steven, who are running like 37, 38 lands in our deck, then it's not unrealistic to hold on to it. So but it really just comes down to your approach to your deck building. I think either way is correct, but it really just depends on the overall build of your deck. Jason's not wrong for saying that, but you have to think about it in the context of how he builds his decks. Whereas I'm not wrong for saying that you can hold on to it for the channel ability, but that's based on the context of how I build my decks. Neither of us are wrong. Just the context is needed. For instance, in the Wilds of Eldraine episode, I was playing a Simic deck, and I had to play the Boseiju earlier in the game because I needed to hit my land drops. I didn't want to fall behind the rest of the table. I didn't want to miss my land drops. But later in the game, I was able to play a bounce land, pick it back up, and use it for later. So they're both are relevant.
The Boseiju, I will say, there is a lot more argument to hold on to Boseiju because of what you were saying a second ago about how you can't counter the ability outside of something like a stifle effect. That does make it innately more powerful than something like a Beast Within or, something like that. So for this one specifically, I do see holding it in your hand to use it for the channel ability more often. But I think a majority of the time, in a majority of situations, you want to be playing these cards for the land.
Yeah. So we're going long, and we have a few more to get through. So I say let's probably just hit the rest of our cards that are on our overall list, and then maybe we can maybe do another episode where we talk about our individual cards that we're not going to get to today. But next up, we have Inventors Fair. This is a legendary land from Kaladesh. I didn't realize it was $15. It was not that expensive last I knew. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain a life. It taps for colorless, and you can pay 4 and tap it to sacrifice it to find an artifact card to put in your hand, then shuffle, and you can only activate that if you have 3 or more artifacts. So, now obviously this is good if you have a lot of artifacts in your deck. Would you just play this in all artifact decks?
I don't have a ton to say about this card because I don't really care for it too much. I think it's good in artifact decks. It's definitely going to gain you some life, and colorless mana, not really that big a deal in artifact decks. You're probably playing colorless artifacts most of the time anyways. I just think that paying 4 mana, sacrificing a land, and then searching for an artifact to put it into your hand, it's good because it's, an artifact tutor on a land. You have to pay 4 mana, you have to sacrifice the land, and then you're putting it into your hand. You're not even putting it onto the battlefield, so now you have to cast it from your hand. And if you're paying 4 mana to tutor up like a Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt, something like that, I just don't think that you got the most use out of this card. But then if you're using it to tutor up something like a Blightsteel, now you've just telegraphed everyone that you're trying to kill people, like, in the next 2 turns, and you can't even put it onto the battlefield, most likely. Unless it's just that point in the game, and you have a ton of lands on the battlefield to use. But that's a different situation. I'm not the biggest fan of Inventors Fair. I think it's a little bit overrated, especially for paying a $15 card. I don't think it does $15 worth of value. Maybe if it gains you 2 life, if you had 3 or more artifacts, and maybe if it was 3 mana and you sacrifice it to search for an artifact, maybe that would make it good enough in my mind. But I'm just not the biggest fan of it. It's good, definitely good, definitely going to be powerful in artifact decks, but overall, nah.
We need to do a podcast episode where we talk about incidental life gain, because I think that is overlooked a lot of the time. I think the fact that it's pretty easy to have 3 or more artifacts, even if you're not an artifact deck. Like, if you're just not a green deck, you are playing mana rocks, so you don't
even need to look at mana
there's
rocks.
So many things that make tokens, like clues or treasures,
artifact
or
tokens
whatever.
Are huge now in Commander.
Yeah, so I think the even if it just gains you a little bit of life, like if it gains you 4 or 5 life over the course of the game, that's not nothing. That's an extra creature that your opponent has to have to swing at you or whatever. And it's, it is best in artifact decks because you'll guarantee gain the life. You'll guarantee have good tutors for to sacrifice it. But I think even if you're not an artifact deck and you're like some kind of combo deck that one of your combo pieces is an artifact deck, the opportunity cost is low. It comes in untapped. It's probably going to gain you some life, and then it's probably a extra tutor in your deck to find one of your combo pieces. So, I agree it's not like broken or anything, but I think that it's good enough that it should go in most artifact decks, negating the fact that it's $15 somehow. And then I think if you have a combo in your deck that one of your combo pieces is an artifact, it's probably worth considering then too, especially if you have a handful of ways to make those artifact tokens and or a lot of mana rocks. And then you can do the Blightsteel thing. You can't just go find a finisher. So next up, we have a pair of cards. These are Academy Ruins and Hall of Heliod's Generosity. So each of these are a legendary land that taps for colorless. Hall of Heliod's Generosity taps for 1 and a white. You can tap it to put an enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. And then Academy Ruins is for 1 and a blue. You can tap it to put an artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. So this is really good if you have some kind of artifact or enchantment that you can repeatedly use, like anything with a sacrifice effect that you want to keep using, or if you just have something really important that you need to keep in play and your opponents want to blow it up. So I think if you're an artifact deck, you should probably consider running Academy Ruins. If you're running an enchantment deck, you should probably run Hall of Heliod's Generosity. And they're not the cheapest cards, but I think if you're in the right colors for them, and these are the archetypes, these are kind of worth running.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. If you're playing white and you have a lot of enchantments, or it's like an enchantment style deck, 100% Hall of Heliod's Generosity. And then same goes for Academy Ruins. Blue artifacts, play the card. The best part about these is they don't sacrifice themselves. So you can get reoccurring value turn after turn, or if you have ways to untap them and then mana to reactivate them, you could potentially get a couple of activations of it per turn, and you can use that to stack the top of your library in a certain order that you want it to be. That's one of the things that's really nice about these cards, is they don't sacrifice themselves, and they allow you to stack cards on top of your library, which can give you value. I mean, Academy Ruins, let's say you put this into a Yuriko deck, and you run
a big
few,
hefty artifact or enchantment.
Yeah, like you put a Caged Sun on top of your library, and now you're dealing 6 to everybody when you reveal it with Yuriko. There's just, and then if you give Yuriko Double Strike, and then you stack 2 different big artifacts on top of your library, now you reveal 1, and that's like, you got your Caged Sun for 6, and then you reveal the other one. Oh, it's your Immortal Sun for another 6. So there's just fun stuff you could do with it like that. But then also, one thing that's nice about these is they almost provide you a little bit of protection from cards like Bojuka Bog that'll exile your graveyard. Somebody's like, all right, I'm going to play the Bojuka Bog. When it enters, exile your graveyard. Okay, with that trigger on the stack, I'm going to activate my Hall of Heliod's Generosity, put my Smothering Tithe back on top of my library so it doesn't get exiled. Or, I'm going to activate my Academy Ruins, put my Blightsteel back on top of my... Well, I guess Blightsteel wouldn't be in your graveyard anyways, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It is a great way to just protect your combo pieces. Like, there's a semi-recent episode of Commander Clash where Krim was playing a Happily Ever After deck, the enchantment that if you meet like 9 different requirements, you win the game. And the Hall of Heliod's Generosity pulled a lot of weight because it kept getting blown up and stuff, and he just was able to keep getting it back. And we've talked about these kind of effects that just put things on top of your library before, and like, oh, well, it's not going to your hand. It's not it could get milled, or you have to wait an extra turn to draw it, whatever. You're just going to incidentally have card draw on the table a lot of the time. Like, attack with this creature, draw a card, or do this thing, draw a card. And you will probably just end up with it in your hand that turn anyways, without having to wait till your next upkeep to draw it.
To go along with what you're saying, also being on top of your library is one of the safer places the card can be. Yeah, there are mill effects out there and things like that.
Or one of your opponents might have a way to force you to shuffle. Well, I don't think there's anything that like makes you shuffle, I guess, but
outside of like, a Chaos Warp, something like that.
Yeah, that's
so
true. That's true.
Putting these cards on top of your library is actually just another way to protect them from other things, because there's not a whole lot of stuff that outside of, like I said, just straight milling, there's not a whole lot of cards that will interact with your library.
All right, so we have 2 more cards we're going to hit today. Next up, we have Karn's Bastion. This was on Preston's list. I don't know if it was on your list. It was pretty low on mine, but it taps for colorless, and you can pay 4 and tap it to proliferate. So I have this in my energy deck because there's just not a lot of energy support, so it's kind of needed in places like that. And then I think it's probably worth it in like Infecty style decks.
Planeswalker
But outside
decks.
of that, it's probably okay in Planeswalker decks, yeah. But I feel like there's enough efficient like proliferating effects that like +1/+1 counter kind of decks and stuff, they probably don't need this. But yeah, Planeswalker decks probably need it. It's probably good in most Infecty style decks. It's okay in energy decks just because there's not a lot of energy support, but it's kind of 5 mana proliferate. That's not very good. So this is like the bottom of the list, but if you really are just playing an under-supported archetype and you need extra proliferate, it's worth considering, especially because it's only $1.
I think that this card, I didn't have it on my list, and that wasn't for anything that wasn't for any bad reason. Like, I've talked about some other cards that weren't on my list that I'm not a fan of. I actually like Karn's Bastion. I think that I agree with you, 5 mana proliferate is not great, but I do think that there are certain decks where this card is really, really powerful. If you have if you have a Planeswalker deck and you have 3 Planeswalkers on the battlefield, I would pay 5 mana to add another loyalty to 3 Planeswalkers I have. 5 mana proliferate loyalty onto 3 Planeswalkers seems good enough,
Especially if that puts you in the range to ultimate your Planeswalker.
Exactly. But then also think about stuff that has come out recently, like the Fallout series. Now you're proliferating rad counters. And that can add a lot of value to anyone's game plan who's playing with that style. I think that it's a good ability, and it definitely has spots where it'll shine more than others. But it's definitely probably the most niche utility land that we've talked about today. Not every deck needs this, and not every deck that can use it wants it.
Yeah, like +1/+1 counters is the main offender in that department. Like
Probably doesn't need it.
There's so much support for +1/+1 counters that I don't think you need
There's
this.
so much support for, if you build your +1/+1 counters deck, it's like anytime a player blinks, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That's essentially what you can do in those types of decks. So this card isn't necessarily great in those decks, but there are other spots where it's really good.
I think if you're a 1-color +1/+1 counter deck, then you probably can run this just because the opportunity cost of having this colorless land is so low that you could probably justify it. But outside of that, yeah. But yeah, I think in certain less supported counter archetypes, it's pretty cool. All right, so we are not going to have time today to go into our individual lists, but we do have one more card that more than one of us said that we're going to hit. Jason, this was not on my list, so why don't you go ahead and lead us through this last card that you and Preston were high on?
Yeah, so this last card that I put on my list was Detection Tower. So it enters untapped, and it taps for a colorless, and it says pay 1 and tap it. Until end of turn, your opponents and creatures your opponents control with hexproof can be the targets of spells and abilities you control as though they didn't have hexproof. This is... I've never seen anybody play this besides myself. I have been the only person I've ever seen in any game of Magic play this card. It was on Preston's list, so I'm sure Preston plays it. But I've just never seen it happen in any game besides when I played on my board.
I know he has it in his colorless deck. I'm not sure what other decks he might have it in.
It's really strong. I do think that more times than not, hexproof is not the protection that people will use these days. It's either like Shroud or Ward. I think I'm seeing a lot more Ward than ever before. But the fact that for 1 mana, you can shut off hexproof for all your opponents and all your opponents' creatures for 2 mana, really, because you have to tap the Detection Tower as well. For 2 mana to do that, to affect all of your opponents and all your opponents' creatures, that in itself is incredibly powerful, especially because it's your opponents. So if you have hexproof or if your creatures have hexproof, you're fine. Can't be touched. Nothing will happen. But being able to do stuff to your opponent's creatures that before you wouldn't have been able to do anything to, that's a really strong thing to have access to. You know, somebody plays a Swiftfoot Boots and equips their thing with Swiftfoot Boots. You know, you activate this, Swiftfoot Boots doesn't really mean anything at this point. I think that this is a really strong card. I don't know if necessarily it should be slotted into every deck, but I do think that a majority of decks would find use in this card.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a deck that can afford to run a lot of utility lands, I think this could eventually get into your deck list. I think it's hard to just auto jam this unless you have like a lot of Voltron-y decks in your play group, in which case it's probably worth it because, you know, those Voltron-y decks are going to be running a lot of things that give them hexproof. The fact that Swiftfoot Boots is so heavily played does raise the value of this a little bit. I kind of wonder if this is a card that gets played in 60 card, because if you're like a burn deck or a combo deck or a mill deck, one of your worst fears is that your opponent will sideboard in the white Leyline, the one that gives you hexproof. So the fact that you could, you know, in those matchups have this, it's kind of funny. But like that doesn't really happen in Commander. I don't think I've ever seen someone play that Leyline in Commander.
I have.
Maybe you would play it in like you have?
Mm-hmm.
Leyline of Sanctity, is that what it is?
Yep, Leyline of Sanctity. I run it in my mono white deck, which that deck's going to get taken apart, unfortunately. And then there was one more deck that I used to run it in for a while. I don't remember which one. I think it might have been
like a White Devotion decks, or
I think it might have been Miracle.
Maybe some enchantment decks. Yeah.
I think I might have run it in Miracle when I first built that. It could have also been an Ur-Dragon. I have a lot of niche enchantments in Ur-Dragon that are really good, you know, in that deck. But outside of my mono white deck that I have, I don't think that I run that Leyline in anything.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think this is just too narrow to run that often, just because, like you said, a lot of the protection nowadays is we don't really see Shroud outside of Lightning Greaves, but Ward we see all the time. If this was like a simply a matter of your opponent's stuff that can't be targeted now can be, and that way it would apply to, well, because the problem that doesn't even work either, because Ward you can target it,
but then it's like, okay, you've targeted it, now the Ward goes on the stack.
Yeah, because that would make it more interesting if it could also get around Ward, because that has become so problematic. But
do you think this is just as niche as Karn's Bastion?
Or I think it's more niche than Karn's Bastion.
Wow!
Because
I disagree.
The only argument for running this, so obviously in colorless lands, why not? Why not run this in colorless decks? But the only thing that holds it up any higher than that, in my opinion, is if you know there's a bunch of Voltron decks in your play group, and the fact that Swiftfoot Boots is still heavily played. Like the fact that Swiftfoot Boots, I don't know how many decks is in. I probably could pull that up real quick, but the fact that that card is played as much as it is makes me think that like maybe it's not terrible. But like a lot of the top commanders don't even have hexproof. So Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots is in 28% of decks according to EDH Rec. So that I think makes it go up in value. But I don't know.
Here's what I'll say. I just think that this card does have a lot more inherent value printed on it than Karn's Bastion, just because I don't think that proliferating is going to be as necessary
like a specific
in every
archetype, right?
But considering that cards like Swiftfoot Boots are running, like you said, 28% of decks, I think that alone calls for this card to be in more than 1% of all commander decks. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, maybe 1% might be too low, because I think part of it's also, a lot of commander is this way, but I think this card is a great example of that. A lot of it might just be metagame dependent. Like I said, if you're playgroup has commanders with hexproof, or you see a lot of Swiftfoot boots in your playgroup, or you have a lot of Voltron decks in your playgroup, then you could it's not even like that's a brutal metagame play. It's just like you're optimizing for how your playgroup functions. It's not like you're even being a jerk about it or anything. Like that's not like a broken thing to do. So, yeah. And you know what, Jason? There might not be any commanders with hexproof. I guess I could have done like a Scryfall search, but I've been scrolling on EDHREC looking for a commander with hexproof, and I just went through the top 100 commanders. None of them have hexproof.
See, but then this card becomes even better when you use it in those situations where somebody gives their commander hexproof thinking it's safe.
Yeah. I think the best defensive detection tower is the fact that Swiftfoot Boots is heavily played. So if that's something you're wanting to keep in consideration and you have the utility land slots, it might be worth considering. I would have been interested to see what Preston's justification was for this one, because he had it at... he edited the doc to where I can't see where it was on his overall list. It was on his overall list, but I would have been interested to see what he thought about that. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Like I said, we had a few cards that were on our individual list that weren't on our overall list that we would have liked to get to. So maybe we'll do a part 2. Maybe we'll have a way to rebrand some of these, an episode with some of these other utility lands that we wanted to talk about that we don't have time for. But yeah, thanks for listening, guys. Make sure you subscribe. Check out some of our other episodes and the other content we're doing over here on the channel. We will be back next week for another topic. Let us know in the comments if there's anything specific you'd like us to tackle, and we will see you guys next time. Bye.